Hello dear students, today we are going to have our 8th lecture of psycholinguistics. So we will continue further studying what we left off in the last lecture. So we'll move on. Now when we were studying about all the processing of how language is processed, the next step that we want to take was perpetual processing. That's what we want to study. So perpetual processing, now although virtually no research has addressed the development of the sensory stores per se, there is a substantial literature on perpetual processing defined more broadly. So even though there hasn't been any exact research done on this, but still they have developed the sensory stores as we studied before, and there is a lot of literature and that we can find related to perpetual processing. So, and it is defined more broadly, like more extensively. So prior to the early 1960s, it was generally believed that infants perceive the world in a disorganized way. So before 1960s, they thought that infants don't understand the world and they have a disorganized way of perceiving or understanding the world. But the baby, now assailed by eyes, ears, nose, skin, and entrails at once, feels it all as one great blooming buzzing confusion. Now that was in 1890. W. James, we referred him on page 488, and according to him, it was all a confusion for the child. Like for the baby, all of that, like he couldn't define the visual processes or the auditory processes or the smelling or the way the thinking process went. So according to his study, it was all a confused thing. Now when we go ahead, and subsequent research however indicates otherwise. Now when we further look at research related to the same thing, it indicates otherwise. That means that it explains us a little more in detail that it's the opposite. James thought that babies are confused about that and they don't have a processing of separately, they don't process things. But in a research by France in 1963, for example, babies were shown various forms while observers recorded how long the infants looked at each one. So their experiment was related to this कि बच्चों को different चीज़ें दिखाई गई and ये note किया गया कि हर बच्चा वो उस चीज़ एक एक चीज़ को कितनी कितनी देर तक देख रहा है. Now a child, a little infant, he cannot express it in words, but they were observing those reactions by how the kid looked at the stuff and how he observed what he was seeing. Now the infants look at some patterns more than others. So some patterns they would pay more attention than the other. Now France interpreted this finding as meaning that the infants could distinguish among the forms and preferred some to the others. So according to him, what he thought that the infants could distinguish, उनको पता लग जाता था, फर्क मालूम हो जाता था कि इसमें से this form, इस shape ये है, इसकी shape ये है, and sometimes उनकी preference किसी एक की तरफ ज़्यादा होती थी. That's why they kept on looking at that exact form again and again. Now, France found that young infants preferred patterns such as faces or checkerboards over plain stimuli. So sometimes they would, that little babies, they preferred patterns such as faces or checkerboards, like checkerboards जो एक आप चेस का जैसे आप पैटर्न खेलते हैं तो उसका जो एक ब्लॉक में होता है ब्लैक एंड वाइट का बोर्ड ओवर प्लेन स्टिमुलाई. अगर उनको प्लेन स्टिमुलाई प्लेन कलर दे दिया जाए, फॉर एग्जांपल let's give them a card. You can even experiment if you have a baby in the family, and you can experiment with them by showing them, let's say, a play card of a plain color. किसी भी plain color का card आप उनको या chart paper उनको दिखाइए, and then show them maybe a photograph, a blown up photograph or a cartoon figure or checkerboards. And you can judge also the way he found that, according to his research, that the children were more interested in looking at the faces or the checkerboard or designs, let's say, instead of the plain stuff. So it stimulated them more to look at the stuff that had some material on it instead of just the plain colors. So that explained that they could distinguish, unko fark pata chal raha tha, the difference, and they were attracted to a certain pattern. Now, more details about experimental techniques and paradigms to study infants' early visual preferences in Karmeloff, Smith and Karmeloff in 2001. Again, a reference of page 40 and 46 in their research work. So in 2001, they they experimented on these techniques, and according to their paradigms to study infants, now the early visual preferences in just as a human face, for example, for whatever reason fascinates infants, so does the human voice. So according to his preference, उसके experiment के हिसाब से बच्चों को faces, human faces attract करते हैं, be it in a picture, a poster, or just people coming up to the infant. You would notice that in a family, if you do have a little baby or a child or any niece or nephew, that those babies, when new people come and look at him, they will stare at that person's face, and some of them will smile, some of them will start crying. So, but they are fascinated by human faces, and they are fascinated by the human voice. Now, when we talk to babies, like we can do baby talk, like whatever, to sort of soothe the baby or try to make it laugh. Now, that human voice also fascinates a child. Now, various studies indicate that infants are biologically prepared to distinguish between speech and other sounds. So most of the studies do indicate this, that infants are biologically prepared, and mentally they're like by birth they are prepared to distinguish between speech and other sounds. So दूसरी sounds को distinguish करना and बोलने का उनको उसको वो फर्क मालूम हो जाता है उनको, when there is speech and when there are other sounds. Now, for instance, Condon and Sander, now in 1974, have shown that infants make synchronized movements. For example, raising a finger, kicking a leg, etc., to individual speech sounds shortly after birth. So, Condon and Sander ने 1974 में ये डिस्कवर किया कि वो ऐसे synchronized movement, यानी they will move with the sound of the speech. Their reaction would be to either kick a leg, or maybe they would raise a finger or raise their arms too. Like that is a very good example. Like if you see that sometimes we hold our arms out, and we always sort of act like we are trying to take the kid in our lap, and we are saying like, come on, let me hold you. And the baby will respond with reaching out his arms in a way that he wants, it's understood by that movement that he wants you to pick him or her up. Now, that's how they say that it's synchronized movements. So they synchronize their movements. They have synchronized का मतलब कि उसमें आवाज़ के साथ वो उसको जो है relate कर देते हैं, जिस तरह उनको speech sound, they'll either kick a leg or do some sort of physical action to show their reaction to that speech. Now, frame-by-frame analysis of these movements indicated that they were synchronized with the syllables in the speech signal. अब जब हमने frame by frame उनका experiment इन्होंने देखा और analyze किया, they realized that these movements indicated that they were synchronized. यानी वो synchronized थे ये movements उनकी of kicking a leg, or maybe holding out their arm or raising their hand, with certain labels in the speech signal. यानी किसी एक खास word पे या किसी एक खास label पे speech signal जो उनको मिल रही है, they would react to that. Now, newborns show this synchrony with different languages, but not with non-speech sounds, like the tapping of a pencil. अब उनका एक्सपेरिमेंट अकॉर्डिंग टू दैट कि न्यूबॉर्न्स जो है दे वुड शो दिस सिंक्रोनिज विद लैंग्वेज, यानी जब उनके साथ बोला जा रहा हो व्हेन दे आर यूजिंग लैंग्वेज, लेकिन नॉन स्पीच साउंड्स के साथ उनका ऐसा कोई रिएक्शन नहीं था. लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ यू हैव अ बेबी इन फ्रंट ऑफ यू एंड यू आर टैपिंग द डेस्क और द टेबल विद अ पेंसिल, दैट विल नॉट gather any reaction from the child. So in a way, a non-speech sound has no effect on a child, though it would attract it, but they would synchronize their actions with different languages. So in any language, whatever their native language, whatever their mother tongue would be, so they would react to that, whatever sounds they hear around them. So it can be in any language. Now, a famous study by Emis et al. In 1971 showed that infants make distinctions between different speech sounds very early in life. So very early in life they make distinctions between different speech sounds. यानी वो उनको फ़र्क पता चल जाता है डिफरेंट स्पीच के साउंड, डिफरेंट साउंड्स, उनका क्वालिटी, हाउ दे वांट टू रिएक्ट, वो उसमें डिफरेंस, दे कैन टेल द डिफरेंस. So even in early in their life, young ages maybe. Now in this study they examined infants' perception of the voicing contrast in English. Now for example, इसमें उन्होंने स्टडी ये किया कि एक बच्चे की परसेप्शन जो है वॉइस कॉन्ट्रास्ट कैसा है इंग्लिश में, उसके साथ उसकी रिएक्शन क्या था. Now contrasting BA, which gives the sound of ba, for which voice onset time VOT would be 0 ms, and pa, for which the VOT would be 40 ms. So in dono ko ba and pa, those were the sounds that they could tell the difference between those. Ek 0 ms ka hai, ek 40 ms ka hai, and a child could recognize or distinguish between those two sounds. So Amos and colleagues used a technique known as habituation paradigm to study infants' responses. So उन्होंने एक program, एक technique को introduce करवाया, which was known as the habituation and paradigm, and that was to study the infants' responses, उनके responses study करने के लिए. Now to these stimuli, to all of these different contrasting voice sounds. Now you can see Karmeloff and Smith, or Karmeloff 2001, in page 20 in the sequence to see in detail about that. Now habituation. Now habituation refers to the decline in a response to a stimulus following repeated presentation of the stimulus. अब बार बार रिपीटेड प्रेजेंटेशन हो स्टिमुलस की, सो फिर उसमें उन दे सॉ द रिस्पॉन्स. सो हैबिटेशन रिफर्स टू द डिक्लाइन इन अ रिस्पॉन्स. हैबिटुएशन का मतलब उन्होंने जो स्टडी किया, दे वर सीन के वो उसमें कम कैसे होता जा रहा था उनका रिस्पॉन्स टू द स्टिमुलस फॉलोइंग रिपीटेड प्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ द स्टिमुलस. यानी फर्स्ट टाइम आप कोई ऐसी स्पीच साउंड करेंगे, सो हाउ द चाइल्ड वुड रिएक्ट टू दैट, एंड देन if you kept on repeating that same thing in front of the child, how the response declined, how it got less. यानी उनका response time आपको कम होता हुआ दिखाई दिया. So the response studied is referred to as non-nutritive sucking and involved a special pacifier that is connected to a computer that measures the number of sucks as infant makes. So pacifier, you know a pacifier, जो बच्चों को हम use कराते हैं when they're crying, we put it in their mouth. So the way they sucked on it, or like even like on their bottles when they're drinking milk, an infant would suck on the bottle to get the milk flowing. So at that point, they connected that pacifier with a computer. ये देखने के लिए कि उसके नंबर ऑफ द सक्स दैट द इन्फेंट मेक्स, उसमें डिफरेंस क्या आया. Now when ba was initially presented, the infant showed great interest and sucking rate was high, but with repeated presentations the sucking decreased. So show ये हुआ कि the kid was excited when he was hearing that sound, but when we kept repeating it, the child started losing interest. So at this point a new stimulus was presented. On some occasions, it was a stimulus from the ba category, VOT between 0 and 25 ms, and on other occasions, it was a stimulus from the pa category between 25 and 40 ms. So, उन्होंने difference ये चीज़ किया कि they wanted to present a new stimulus. So, just to see के categories में के between यानी 0 to 25 में क्या फ़र्क आया, and फिर 25 से 40 में पाम की जो category थी उसमें क्या फ़र्क आया. So, they tried to distinguish the difference between that by judging the child's reaction. Now, the interesting result was that sucking returned briefly to a high level dishabituation if the new stimulus was from a different category. अगर different category use की गई तो दोबारा से बच्चे का interest नज़र आया उसमें. But if the new stimulus was from the same category, it would not show any reaction. Like slowly the kid would be getting disinterested. Same thing, you can take that example as like when you're playing with babies. If you show them a new thing, for example, let's say keys. So when you show them a bunch of keys, the child will be very attracted. It will immediately try to take hold of the keys. But if you keep on dangling that key in front of the child, in the start it will be attracted. Later on it'll get sort of distracted from it and lose interest. So a repetition of things makes the child lose interest. So non-nutritive in technique taken together, studies of perpetual processing by infants reveal infants to have rather sophisticated perpetual skills at birth or shortly after birth. So इन सारे स्टडी से हमें ये समझ आया कि इन्फेंट्स का जो है either at birth or after a little while after birth, shortly after birth, उनके अंदर sophisticated perpetual skills मौजूद होती हैं. They do have that in them. So that would be a biological factor. Now these results at least suggest that infants are well equipped at birth to process linguistic stimuli. So ये सारे results जब हम इन experiments के देखते हैं, so we can distinguish, or we can suggest that at the time of birth, a child or an infant is well equipped to process linguistic stimuli. That means to understand or to comprehend linguistic stimuli. Even though at that point a child cannot speak, but he can understand the differences of the sounds. So when we move on to once again that we were studying about the short-term STM and working memory, the WM, a second aspect of the cognitive system that has been examined developmentally is short-term memory. So once we finish with the children's experiments, then we move on going back into the same thing that I explained to you when we were talking about short-term memory and working memory. Now a second aspect of the cognitive system has been examined developmentally would be the short-term memory. We were talking about the working memory before that. So a common test of STM in grade school children is a simple memory span test. So STM एक test develop हुआ, common test, that grade school children में हमने वो test यानी conduct हुआ, and it's a simple memory span, just to check how the short-term memory works in children. Now the children are presented with a list of numbers and asked to recall them, sometimes in forward order and sometimes in backward order. So एक्सपेरिमेंट क्या था कि बच्चों को हमने एक लिस्ट ऑफ नंबर्स दिए एंड हमने उनको कहा कि उसको जस्ट लुक एट इट एंड देन रिकॉल इट, एक दफ़ा फिर उसको रिपीट करें याददाश्त से. So sometimes they need to repeat it, let's say in a forward manner, forward like going from, let's say from 1 to 10, we would go 1, 2, 3, 4 like that, going up to the 10, or sometimes in a backward order, going from 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 like that, trying to memorize it. Now it is clear that there are significant differences between older and younger children on this task. अब ये तो एक understood सी बात है Okay, an older child will have more easy access to do such tests or conduct a memory span test than a younger child would. Younger children, sometimes there is a difference between how an older child will comprehend it and how a younger child would comprehend it. So in fact, the simple memory span test is a standard feature on intelligence test for that very reason. So इसलिए simple memory span test, the STM is a standard feature on intelligence test for that very reason. हम intelligence test में उसको importance देते हैं just because of that. Now C. Dempster, FN in 1981, that also is a reference that you can check out. Memory span. Now memory span sources of individual and developmental differences. Psychological bulletin. So in the psychological bulletin in 89, 63 and 100, that also is a reference. You can see that memory span sources of individual and developmental differences. उनके हमने individual source का individual भी देखना है and उसका developmental difference भी check करना है. Now these results, however, do not tell us much about the development of working memory. Even though कि हमने ये test किया, but it doesn't explain or the way that working memory is developed. That is very different. Now, working memory indeed consists of both storage and processing functions. The same way like I told you before. Okay, working memory would consist of storing the material and the processing function and how to process the language. Now, these compete for limited resources. So limited resources में जो है working memory काम कर रही होती है, so both storing and processing the both functions. They are how we would remember something, how we would produce the language, so even using less sources. Now, thus a developmental change in either of these functions would affect the other. So अगर इन दोनों में से किसी एक में भी developmental change आएगा तो वो दूसरे को affect ज़रूर करेगा. So in particular, if children become more efficient in processing numbers, fewer resources would be needed for that function. So अगर बच्चे जो हैं they would be more efficient in processing numbers, फिर हमें resources हमारे कम use होंगे. Then less resources or fewer resources would be needed to perform that function. Now thereby leaving more resources available for storage. So अगर उनको यानी efficient हो जाए ज़्यादा वो to recognize and proceed and remember those numbers, then storage के लिए हमारे पास ज़्यादा availability हो जाती है resource में. Now in this way simple memory span might improve without any change in the total size of working memory. So if we consider it like this, then the simple memory span might improve it. So without any change in the total size of यानी working memory के size में फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, but simple memory span जो है that might improve our working memory, यानी उसको बेहतर कर रहेगा. So a series of elegant experiments by Case et al. In 1982 has confirmed this analysis. So उन्होंने इन experiments को उन्होंने elegant experiments conduct किए and उसने ये analysis confirm किया कि in their first experiment 3 to 6 year olds were given a storage and a processing task. यानी 3 से 6 साल के बच्चे को storage और processing का एक task दिया गया. Now the storage task was a simple memory task of remembering a list of 7 words. So storage task जो है वो बिल्कुल simple आ गया, like we told you before in the previous lectures that memory can work on a shorter span or on less words. So 7 words, that's very easy to memorize. So the storage task was a simple memory task. So 7 words के ऊपर उनको याद करना था. They had to do that. Now the processing task, अब उनको एक processing task भी दिया गया. The processing task was a repetition task. They had to repeat it, in which the children had to repeat auditory presented words. So they had to repeat those words in the processing task. So the investigators measured the time between the presentation of the word and the onset of the child's vocal response. तो उन्होंने बीच में एक्सपेरिमेंट कैसे ये कंडक्ट हुआ कि उन्होंने ये इन्वेस्टिगेटर्स ने मेजर किया कि वो जो टाइम स्पैन है जो उनको बच्चों को प्रेजेंटेशन दी गई वर्ड की उसमें और ऑनसेट ऑफ द चाइल्ड्स वोकल रिस्पांस जो चाइल्ड ने वोकल रिस्पांस दिया उसका टाइम स्पैन क्या था, डिफरेंस क्या था. नाउ द सेम वर्ड्स वर यूज्ड इन बोथ टास्क्स. दोनों टास्क में सेम वर्ड्स यूज किए. फर्स्ट में उनको 7 words याद करने के लिए and secondly to repeat those. Now in case et al, once again as a reference, found a negative correlation between the two tasks. As response time increased, reflecting processing load, memory span decreased. So जितना time span बढ़ गया उन words को present करने में जब उनको प्रेजेंट किया गया और फिर उनसे बच्चों से रिपीट करवाया गया. नाउ जब उन्होंने ये उसमें एक नेगेटिव कोरिलेशन देखा बिटवीन द टू टास्क्स इन प्रोसेसिंग एंड द मेमोरी, एज जब रिस्पॉन्स टाइम इंक्रीज हुआ तो मेमोरी स्पैन जो है आपका टू मेमोराइज दोज थिंग्स वो डिक्रीज हो गया. नाउ ओल्डर चिल्ड्रन रिमेंबर्ड मोर वर्ड्स देन यंगर चिल्ड्रन. ओल्डर चिल्ड्रन उनको वो लफ्ज़ ज़्यादा देर तक याद रहे, उनको ज़्यादा लफ्ज़ याद रहे निस्बतन छोटे बच्चों के. But when their reaction time was taken into account, there were no difference between the two age groups. So, the older children, they remembered more words. उनको words ज़्यादा याद हुए, but younger children के निस्बत. But जब उनको हमने दोनों को time span देखा कि उन्होंने reaction कितने time में दिया, तो दोनों एज ग्रुप्स में there was no difference. They both reacted into it at the same point, same time span. So a second experiment then was presented and conducted on presented adults with the same two tasks. अब adults के ऊपर फिर हमने जब children के ऊपर हमने ये किया उसके बाद फिर adults के ऊपर उन्होंने ये दो task का same experiment किया using nonsense words. ऐसे words that with which adults have no familiarity. Nonsense words, something that has no sense, या adults को जिनका कोई उनको familiar नहीं है, आदी नहीं है उन words के, तो ऐसे words उनको दिए गए और यही दो tests उन पे conduct हुए. Now adults' reaction time to nonsense words was slow, comparable to children's reaction time to real words. यानी जब अडल्ट्स को ऐसे वर्ड्स दिए गए जो बेमायनी थे, ठीक है, तो उनका रिएक्शन टाइम स्लो था निस्बतन कि जो यंगर चिल्ड्रन को हमने रिएक्शन टाइम दिया रियल वर्ड्स का, देयर रिएक्शन टाइम वाज लार्जर देन व्हाट द अडल्ट्स रिस्पॉन्डेड एट. सो इफ मेमोरी स्पैन डिपेंड्स अपॉन प्रोसेसिंग स्पीड, सो अगर मेमोरी स्पैन जो है वो प्रोसेसिंग सिर्फ स्पीड से ही रिलेटेड है, देन अडल्ट्स रिकॉल ऑफ द नॉनसेंस वर्ड्स शुड बी ऑल्सो बी सिमिलर टू द यंगर चाइल्ड्स रिकॉल ऑफ द रियल वर्ड्स, एंड इट वाज. सो मेमोरी स्पैन में तो उनका प्रोसेसिंग स्पीड अगर हम देखें कि सेम है, तो उनका रिकॉल जो था द वे दे रिमेंबर्ड इट ऑफ द इट शुड बी वेरी सिमिलर टू अडल्ट्स का टू द यंगर चिल्ड्रन, way they remembered the real words. And it was. So the studies thus demonstrated that when adults are slowed down to children's speed of processing, memory span differences disappear. So ये चीज़ इस रिजल्ट इससे ये कंडक्ट हुआ कि जब अडल्ट्स को हम स्लो डाउन कर देते हैं उस लेवल तक ऐसे वर्ड्स देके जो जिसको वो रिकग्नाइज नहीं करते, वो चिल्ड्रन की स्पीड ऑफ प्रोसेसिंग पे आ जाते हैं. एंड व्हेन दे डू दैट देन मेमोरी स्पैन डिफरेंसेस डिसअपीयर. सो उस वक्त मेमोरी स्पैन जो उनके फ़र्क है ऑफ हाउ अडल्ट वुड रिमेंबर समथिंग और हाउ अ चाइल्ड वुड, वो डिफरेंस डिसअपीयर हो जाता है, इट डिसअपीयर्स. So basically they're both equal at that time when adult has been given something that is unfamiliar to him. But if you see that if an adult is memorizing something that if he's given the real words, then the span time, memory span time would be at very high, much higher than a young child's speed. So that's why what they wanted to see was that when conducting this experiment, that if when we gave them familiar words, okay, an adult's memory maybe is more than a child's, so and their way of understanding or processing it, their speed would be a little higher. But when they are slowed down with words that have no meaning to them or make no sense to them, their memory span would be equal to a child's when a child is shown the real words. So Case and colleagues concluded that there is no substantial increase in overall working memory capacity with development, at least from 6 years to adulthood. So एक चीज़ इन्होंने conclude कर लिया कि substantial increase नहीं था overall working memory में between or the capacity of how it got developed or how it increased from the age of 6 to adulthood. यानी 6 साल की एज से लेके बड़े होने तक उनकी वर्किंग मेमोरी की कैपेसिटी की डेवलपमेंट में कोई फर्क नहीं आया. Now under this interpretation, simple memory span shows a functional increase in storage due to the greater efficiency of processing. So इस interpretation से अगर हम देखें तो simple memory span जो है वो shows a functional increase. वो increase show करता है storage में, storage time में, because due to the greater efficiency of processing, क्योंकि process ज़्यादा efficiency से किया जा रहा है. So that's why they would store it more. So this notion of developmental changes in processing efficiency is highly relevant to understanding early reading by children. तो इस चीज़ को अगर हम देखेंगे developmental changes में, so processing efficiency अगर हमने देखनी है, so it's highly relevant to understanding ये समझने में कि how early reading by children के बच्चे पढ़ के कैसे process करते हैं language को. So the conclusion of all of this experiments would be that globally speaking, observed differences between children and adults on cognitive tasks have more to do with the use of information processing resources than with qualitative shifts in thinking. Now, as it is somehow suggested by Pagets' interpretation of cognitive development. So somehow Pagets ने भी यही चीज़ suggest की, यही interpret किया cognitive development में, कि globally speaking जो है कि कोई differences children और adults में नहीं थे on cognitive tasks. Cognitive tasks had no difference between children and adults, and it has more to do with the use of information processing, how an adult would process an information and how a child would go about processing it. And processing resources then with qualitative shifts. So qualitative shifts in thinking has nothing to do with it, but it has more to do with the processing resources. Now the major change over time is an increase in efficiency or a decrease in the amount of cognitive capacity required for a particular task. So major change जो है वो over the time हमने ये देखा कि वो it was an increase in efficiency की increase थी, or a decrease in the amount of cognitive capacity, या तो उसमें जो है major change जो है over the time efficiency में increase हुआ, या फिर cognitive capacity में decrease हुआ amount required for a particular task, किसी खास एक task के लिए. So increased efficiency enables a child to do simultaneously 2 or more tasks, or a complex task with 2 or more components. So increased efficiency जो है अगर हम efficiency एक child की increase कर दें, तो that enables the child to do simultaneously 2 or more tasks, एक साथ वो 2 या 2 से ज़्यादा task कर सकते हैं. और अगर complex tasks हम उनको देते हैं, so 2 or more components के साथ. So this is directly pertinent to language acquisition. So ये directly language acquisition से related होगा. It's very important to that. So, indeed, in order to acquire a language now, a child must perform correct analysis simultaneously on the phonological, morphological, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic levels. So, agar a child wants to acquire a language, They want to perform a correct analysis at the same time on phonological, morphological, syntax, the structure of the language, semantic, the meaning of the language, and pragmatic levels. A child of 3 years old may approach the task in a way that is similar to adults, but less efficient. So a child of 3 years old, 3 साल का बच्चा होगा, वो मे बी उस टास्क को डिफरेंट तरीके से अप्रोच करेगा, similarly to an adult. So when we see the way the children will acquire a language, वो language हासिल कैसे करते हैं, we would say that a child must perform the correct analysis at the same time on all the 4 aspects of phonological, morphological, syntax, semantic, and pragmatic levels. Now, a child of 3 years old may approach the task in a way that is similar to adults but less efficient. He would do the same task just like an adult would do it. Maybe efficiency level kam hogi, but he would conduct it or approach to conduct that task in the similar way. Now, for example, when working on new syntactic structures, which is a demanding task, the child may compensate by attending less to phonological specification. So, अगर हम example देखें कि when working on a new syntactic structure, new structure of sentences में, जो एक बहुत demanding task है, which is a very difficult thing, especially for a child, the child may compensate by attending less to phonological specification. So phonological specification की तरह maybe कम attention show करेगा. Now perhaps only later, when the syntax becomes a little easier, will the child be able to master both levels simultaneously. So later on maybe जब syntax जो है वो थोड़ा सा आसान हो जाता है, at that time a child might be able to master both, दोनों चीज़ों को वो master कर सकता है, both levels एक साथ. Now language acquisition by a child. When we study what language acquisition by a child means, all normal infants are highly receptive to speech sounds even a few days after their birth. So according to all these experiments that we were studying about, so अगर हम देखें तो subnormal children, ठीक है, they are very highly receptive. That means कि वो receive अच्छे तरीके से speech sounds को करते हैं even after a few days after their birth. Even newborn babies, हम जब उनके साथ बात करते हैं तो they give us a reaction. Now from the very beginning, children appear to discriminate speech from non-speech and seem to pay particular attention to human voice as opposed to other environmental sounds. So शुरू से अगर हम we look at children, how they react and how they would what response they are giving, so we could see that वो discriminative speech की तरफ ज़्यादा ध्यान दे रहे हैं निस्बतन non-speech sounds. Like I said, tapping a pencil, like I explained in the previous slides, that tapping a pencil would maybe not attract a child particularly, but a human voice attracts a child. And any other environmental sounds going about, like for example there is traffic sound or any other people talking and speaking out in the hall, but a child, when you're speaking directly to a child, the child might not pay attention to any other sound as attentively as he would to a human voice. So an infant is particularly sensitive to its mother's voice. Now that is a very good example. एक child जो है वो particularly sensitive होता है अपने mother की voice के साथ, how the mother's voice sounds. Now, as Kess in 1992 observes, in many cases, it is sensitive to its own mother's voice while still in the womb. So Kess ने 1992 में ये observe किया कि बहुत सारे cases में even a child would be more sensitive to the mother's, यानी अपनी mother का sound, even when it's in the womb, it can hear the mother, and the child would be responsive to it. Now, Emis et al. In 1985 observed that infants perceive some sounds in a categorical way from as early as 1 month of age. So in 1985 में उन्होंने ये observe किया कि infants को they perceive some sounds, कुछ sounds को categorical way में वो different तरीके से perceive करते हैं, understand करते हैं from as early as 1 month of age. यानी 1 month के जो है 1 महीने के हुए, from that time they would perceive the sounds categorically. Now, according to the latest research, an infant can distinguish between 2 syllables differing only in voicing. अब 2 syllables में वो distinguish कर सकता है just between an infant would just choose those 2 words. Now, for example, when you see a child, the child learns how to say pa or ma or mama or papa. Now, these are the 2 different, they are 2 different syllables and giving 2 different sounds, and the child can distinguish between the 2. उसको फर्क पता चल जाता है दोनों का. He knows who he's going to call papa and who he's going to call mama. Now, these differing only in voicing, pa and ma, stop consonants and semi-vowels, like for example B versus W, between contrasts in both voicing and place of articulation. Now, V versus S. And even contrasts in tongue height and placement of A and I. So even हम जब tongue height में भी देखते हैं कि हमें ये difference आता है ना, A when we are saying it at a lower level, I when we take it to a higher level. So voice articulation, sound difference जो है वो V and S versus or A and I. तो इन चीज़ों के differences भी बच्चा जो है वो distinguish कर सकता है. It cannot discriminate the voicing contrast of S and Z or S and Z. So, but it can discriminate the stop contrast between P and B. So, S and Z का में भी difference उसको voicing contrast उसको discriminate नहीं कर सकता child, but he can discriminate the by stopping the contrast between P and B. Now, the infants have not enough knowledge to discriminate the voicing feature. They only do what adults do in making discrimination. So, एक child की इतने knowledge नहीं होती उस time पे कि वो voicing features को exactly discriminate कर सके. So what they do is they only do what adults do in making discrimination. जो adults sound करेंगे, that's how the child would react. They themselves cannot create that. Now, Cass in 1992, page 286 suggests that infants may begin life with a generalized ability for categorical perception. So infants sometimes they would begin life with a generalized ability for categorical perception, यानी उनको category wise वो perception किस तरह perceive करते हैं चीज़ को, वो generalized ability it begins at a younger age. Now, using some system of feature detectors that pay attention to certain acoustic properties. Sometimes ऐसा system जो detect करता है, they pay attention to certain acoustic properties, उन acoustic properties को attention जो ज़्यादा show कर रहा हो. So a child would maybe have a generalized ability to उसको category में लाना. Now, such properties are ones that involve possible speech categories in human languages. ये possibilities वो हैं जो ये properties हैं जो they would involve खास speech categories को जो human languages में होती हैं. Now, thus the effect of linguistic experience is the loss of the ability to discriminate those differences. So, even the effect जो है linguistic experience का जो loss है, is the loss of the ability. The effect of it, of linguistic experience, is the loss of the ability to discriminate those differences. उन differences को discriminate करने में, which are not phonetic in the language they acquire. So even जो language वो acquire कर रहे हैं उसमें भी phonetic नहीं है, but they can discriminate the difference. Now, infants can make distinction only in their parents' language. सिर्फ वो फ़र्क कहाँ पे जान सकते हैं? When their parents are speaking to them. So only a distinction, only in their parents' language. They lose the ability to detect distinctions that do not occur in the native language. अब something that native language में अगर नहीं है, उसमें वो distinctions को detect नहीं कर सकते. Like for example, let's say that we have you have a brother or a sister, younger brother or sister, a baby, and that child, that baby would react or make a distinction between when your parents are speaking. So parents would be using the native language. But let's say, for example, if somebody else goes up and starts speaking, let's say your parents are speaking Urdu with the child, and let's say if you would go and start speaking in English, so you wouldn't see that ability. They can't. You can see that they are at a loss to detect distinctions between their native language, Urdu, that they've heard from their parents, and the words that you're using in English. They wouldn't react to it. Now, Worker and her colleagues in 1984 observed that 6 to 8 months old children from an English background begin to distinguish contrast that occur in other languages. So Worker and colleagues ने ये observe किया कि 6 to 8 months old children जो हैं, they from an English background, they would begin to distinguish contrasts that occur in other languages. यानी वो उस एज पे आके मे बी डिस्टिंग्विश करना शुरू करें जो कॉन्ट्रास्ट आता है लैंग्वेज के साउंड्स में, डिफरेंट लैंग्वेजेस के साउंड्स में. At the age of 12 months, they develop their sense of distinction to a great extent. So 6 to 8 months से वो start होती है, and फिर वो they would say that it would occur more and increase by the age of 12 months. So 12 months की age तक they develop their sense of distinction a little bit more growing. So in the beginning it was assumed that merely imitation or mechanical repetition was enough for a child to acquire language. So start में तो ये belief था सिर्फ कि merely imitation, imitate करना, ठीक है, नकल उतारना या मैकेनिकल रेपिटेशन या बार बार एक चीज़ को रिपीट करना एक बच्चे को लैंग्वेज सिखाने के लिए काफ़ी है. ये पहले की थॉट थी. So as we have discussed in this topic earlier, infants grasp the mother's language and try to imitate. So जैसे हमने डिस्कस किया कि infants को वो मदर जो उससे बोल रही होगी, they will try to imitate it. उसकी नकल में love same thing बोलेंगे. So a little baby, when you're teaching the baby to speak, or let's say that the mother starts saying to the child that say mama. Now she is repeating that again and again in front of the child, and the child would see the mother saying those words and try to imitate it. And that's how they would learn how to say mama. Now, before the 1950s, though, the people had this conception that children imitated adults around them and that their speech gradually became more accurate. So, 1950s से पहले ये conception that the people had this conception, उनको ये idea था कि children imitated adults, कि वो adults को imitate करते थे, the people who would say things around them, and their speech gradually became more accurate. और उनकी speech ज़्यादा accurate हो गई या ज़्यादा बेहतर हो गई उस time पे, because they were repeating what the adults were saying. Now, but in later stages, यानी ये 1950s में था कि उन लोगों को ये concept था ना कि जो बड़े बोलेंगे बच्चे उसको repeat करेंगे और उस तरह उनका language बेहतर होगी. But in later stages, it was observed by psycholinguists that mere imitation or mechanical repetition is not enough for a child to acquire language. So later stages पे ये चीज़ observe ज़रूर psycholinguists जो थे उन्होंने ये चीज़ देखी कि सिर्फ imitation and mechanical repetition बार बार repeat करने से it's not just enough for a child to acquire or learn a language. Now they also require natural exposure. Both nature and nurture influence the acquisition of language in children. So they also require natural exposure. उनको natural exposure भी चाहिए. And both nature and nurture influence the acquisition of language in children. So nature के साथ जो चीज़ है, that also, and nurturing, the influence that would in how the child would learn a language or how they would acquire acquisition of the language. So ये दोनों चीज़ें फर्क पड़ती हैं, not only just nature but nurture also. So psycholinguists argue that language learning is entirely the product of experience and environment around us. So psycholinguists ने क्या चीज़ डिस्कवर किया कि language learning जो है, किसी ज़ुबान का सीखना, वो entirely product है of experience है, सिर्फ experience के base पे, and the environment around us, और उस environment जो हमारे इर्द गिर्द है. Now, some others have suggested that everybody has an innate language learning mechanism which determines learning or acquisition of language identical for each of us. So sometimes कुछ दूसरे लोग ये भी समझते हैं कि हर एक का innate language learning mechanism है, ठीक है, and that determines learning or acquisition of language identical for each of us, और वो similar कर देता है, it's like very similar or very identical for all of us to learn a language. But when we say that it's a product of experience and environment around us, that is so true, because like before I've given you an example and I'll give it again, that I learned Urdu when I came to Pakistan. So when I was in an environment where that Urdu language was spoken, that's how I kept on experiencing hearing the words, and then I kept on experiencing using and processing the language. And so environment really mattered. Now, if I was, for example, while I was living in the US, even though I had the basic knowledge of the language of Urdu, I didn't know how to speak it properly. Because in that environment in the US, nobody was speaking in Urdu. Everybody spoke in English. So same thing here. Now, if everybody around you would speak in English to you, then you would create that environment around yourself, and your learning of the language would increase. The level of learning would increase. Now, the reason why when you come to universities and you have all your lectures and all your subjects and everything in English, that's how you learn to pick that language easier, and you have more experience in it. Day by day, you keep on experimenting, and then according to that environment, then you start learning. Same thing, like you can say that, for example, like we say that the background has to be strong. A child's background has to be strong in English so that he can study or learn that language more easily when he comes to college or university. Now, why do we say that? Because if the background, like if in schools, your teachers would constantly, at lower ages, like in grade 1 to grade 10th, if they would start at that age speaking in English with the children, in the start, obviously, a child will have difficulty. But if they start speaking with the child in English at that time, that would create a base. So the environment around the child would be developed for English language. And by the time they come to the college or university, it's very easy for them to understand English, because it's very natural. Now they're speaking Urdu at home and with their friends, and they're speaking English in their schools. But at majority nowadays, that when our schooling system does not use English so frequently, then that creates a weak background. So by creating that weak background, by the time you are studying, let's say, in an Urdu medium school, and by the time you come to college or university, you're expected to learn a new language, English, and you are supposed to experiment in it, and the environment around you immediately changes. So at that time it's a little difficult to grasp it. But gradually, when you keep on studying there in that college or university, the environment would affect you and you would learn the language. So many other people say that everybody has that same learning mechanism, and it determines how the learning or acquisition of a language is identical for each of us. So, but I would say that every person has a different way of perceiving. Now, everybody is, why is it identical? Because everybody has the ability to understand a language, or explain the language, or try to learn it, or acquire a language. But the method or the speed would be how they would process it. So how well your working memory would be, how well your perpetual skills would be. So how you would end up using and processing that language. So it's not all about just how it influences the acquisition in children, but even in adults. So naturally you expose yourself to a certain language and then you start learning it. So by the time, let's say that you are listening to these lectures, you are going to get used to the language, and you will start understanding it. Even if in the start you're having difficulty understanding the lectures completely in English, but gradually you will. So that's what psycholinguistics is all about. So the psycholinguists, the people who were researching this, they argued that language learning would be a total product of experience and the environment. So it makes a huge difference. So today, because we learned about lots of stuff related to language learning, how a child would acquire a language, how the child would process the language, how infants would process a language, and how the infant, a baby, would, a few months, or let's say newly born baby, would react to the speech sounds. So all of this is the processes that are going on in our mind, in our brain. So how the brain processes language, that's all what psycholinguists would study. So psycholinguistics is like basically it is teaching us how to distinguish between language learning and how we would process the language. So how you would use your sensory systems, how you would listen to something, how you would comprehend it, how you would understand it, all of that is related to your brain. How you are going to perceive something. So when the best experiments would be when children start learning a language, because they are the best examples. Let's say they say that it's very easy to imprint something on a child's mind. The reason is because at that time the child doesn't have a lot of knowledge stored. So when the storage is less, at that time the child is learning about more things, different things. And by doing that, he's storing more knowledge. By the time he becomes an adult, he has all of those memories. He knows the basics of the language, you know all the grammar rules, you know, you keep on gathering that knowledge and storing it in your brain. And that is how your brain works to process a language. And then you deliver it. So today, students, we will end our 8th lecture there, and we will continue learning about how children process language, how they acquire language, and we will study further about the experiments that the psycholinguists performed on children and adults, and how they argue about their experiences, and how basically language is related to the mind. So further on in the next lecture we will continue the same thing, so please do remember that we are going to continue going on with how a child would acquire language, or how an adult would. So thank you so much. Good day.